Cop slapped a black woman in court. Seconds later, she took the judge's seat. The story begins right there, and I was in the middle of it. I still remember the sound of that slap. It wasn't just a hit on my skin. It was the sound of disrespect, echoing through the whole courtroom, like they wanted everyone to know that I was nothing.
Please approach the bench.
Like I was someone they could humiliate without fear.
Order!
The officer's
You're a
palm
crook!
landed on my cheek.
I'm telling you, you
the
are a
audience
crook!
gasped, but then they laughed. Some even smirked.
Order.
Because in their eyes,
Yes.
I was just another black woman standing on the wrong side of power. I could feel the heat on my face, but I didn't. Bow my head, I didn't flinch. I looked straight into his eyes, and I smiled, because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in just a few seconds, everything would change. But let me take you back a little, so you understand why this courtroom looked at me the way it did. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Houston. You know the kind. Fresh-cut lawns, houses that look the same, mailboxes lined up like soldiers, and of course, an HOA board that thinks it owns every single one of us. I've seen it all. Fines for grass being too long, warnings for parking your car a little too close to the curb, even nasty letters if your trash bin sat outside for more than a few minutes. Small rules, petty rules, but they love their power, and they always look for someone to crush. That someone was me, at least that's what they thought. It started when I refused to repaint my front door. Yes, just a door. They said my shade of blue wasn't community approved. I laughed. I ignored the letters. But they didn't like being ignored, so they fined me, they threatened me, and when I still refused, they dragged me to their so-called HOA court. That's where I first saw those officers, the ones who had later slapped me. They stood tall, hands on their belts, eyes full of arrogance, as if they were the kings of this small suburban kingdom. I walked into that courtroom like anyone else. No fancy clothes, no bodyguards, nothing to show my status, because sometimes power doesn't need a crown. It waits quietly until the right moment. The HOA president smirked when she saw me. She leaned forward and whispered to her lawyer. I could tell by her eyes that she thought this was her victory day. But victory is a dangerous word. It can turn into defeat in just one breath. The hearing began with accusations. Words like violation and non-compliance filled the air. The crowd laughed quietly. Some shook their heads like I was a criminal. And then, when I spoke back, when I dared to challenge them, that's when the officer's hand struck my face. But here's the truth. I wasn't scared, because this wasn't just their court. It was mine too. You see, what nobody realized, not the board, not the officers, not even the judge waiting in the back, was that I wasn't only a homeowner. I wasn't just a neighbor fighting over a painted door. I was a judge, their judge, and that courtroom where they mocked me was the same courtroom where I had signed rulings, where I had decided cases, where my gavel had once silenced men twice their size. The irony was almost too much. They had tried to break me in the one place where I had the most power, and that made my smile grow wider. The officer didn't like that smile. He leaned closer and whispered, "You don't belong here." But oh, how wrong he was. I sat still. I didn't fight. I didn't argue, because I knew my moment was coming. And when it came, it would be louder than any slap. The crowd thought the slap was the end of me. But in truth, it was the beginning of the end for them. Because just a few minutes later, the real judge of the day, the man in the robe, would walk in, and when he saw me, he wouldn't see a victim. He wouldn't see a criminal. He would see the one person who had the power to turn this entire room upside down. And that's exactly what happened. The question is, what do you think the crowd felt in that instant? When the woman they mocked, humiliated, and slapped walked forward and took the judge's seat. Tell me in the comments, would they feel fear, shame, or would they finally understand justice? The room went silent. The air itself felt heavy. The crowd shifted in their seats as the door opened at the back of the courtroom. Every eye turned, every breath paused. The judge walked in, his robe trailing behind him, his face calm, but his eyes were sharp. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the papers in his hand. Then he looked up and saw me for a moment. He froze. His lips parted, but no words came. The officers glanced at him with smug faces. They thought he would join them. They thought he would scold me, punish me, break me. But instead, his face turned pale, like he had seen a ghost sitting. In the front row, I watched him closely. I could see the recognition in his eyes. He knew me, not as a stranger, not as a homeowner with a painted door, but as the judge who had shared the same bench, the same cases, the same justice. The audience had no idea. To them, I was just another name on an HOA violation form. But to him, I was a colleague, a woman who had held power equal to his. And in that moment, the balance in the room shifted. The judge cleared his throat. His hands trembled as he placed the papers down. The officers frowned, confused by his hesitation. The HOA president leaned forward. Her smirk faltered for the first time. Something in her eyes whispered doubt, like. She felt her victory slipping away. And then, the judge did something no one expected. He stepped back, slowly, carefully, and moved away from the bench. The room gasped. The crowd leaned forward. The officers exchanged nervous glances, because the one man they trusted to crush me was silently making space. For me, I stood up. My steps echoed on the marble floor. The officer who had slapped me stiffened. He reached for my arm, but I brushed past him. The power in my walk made him hesitate, because suddenly I was no longer small. I was no longer their target. I was something else, something greater. I climbed the steps, slow, steady, unshaken. The judge's chair stood tall. Black leather, polished wood. It wasn't just furniture. It was a throne, and for years it had been mine. Now it was mine again. I turned and faced them all. The officers, the board, the crowd. Their faces told me everything. Shock, fear, disbelief. They had mocked me. They had slapped me. They had tried to bury me under their rules. But now I stood above them, looking down from the highest seat in the room. The gavel rested on the desk. I lifted it in my hand. The weight was familiar. It was the sound of authority, the sound of truth. And when I struck it once against the wood, the echo silenced every whisper, every laugh, every arrogant smirk. The HOA president's face turned red. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. Her power slipped away with every second, because everyone in the room now knew the truth. This wasn't their trial. It was mine, and they were the ones under judgment. The officer who had slapped me looked pale. He glanced at the door, like he was already planning his escape. But there was no escape. Not from me, not from justice. I leaned forward, my voice calm, clear, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. You wanted me silent, I said. You wanted me humiliated. You thought I was powerless. And yet here I sit, above all of you. The words hit harder than his slap. The audience shifted. Some lowered their heads, ashamed. Others stared in awe, because the story they thought they were watching had turned upside down in seconds. The irony was sweet. The same hands that had tried to drag me down now shook with fear of what I might say, what I might decide, and I had all the time in the world to decide. I let the silence linger. I let them feel the weight of their arrogance, and I asked myself a question I wanted them to hear. What is justice, if not the moment when the powerful fall and the silence rise? I held their eyes as I spoke, and I could see it, the fear, the shame, the sudden understanding that their world was no longer in their control. But I'll ask you this. If you were sitting in that courtroom, watching the woman they slapped take the judge's seat, would you cheer for justice? Or would you stay quiet, afraid of what comes next? The gavel still echoed in the courtroom. But the silence that followed was louder. Every face stared at me, like I had just broken the laws of nature. Like a ghost had risen and claimed a throne. I could see the officer's hand trembling by his side, the same hand that had slapped me minutes earlier, now useless, now weak, and he couldn't hide it. The HOA president shifted in her seat. Her eyes darting from me to the crowd. She wanted someone to back her up. She wanted strength from her allies, but all she found was fear. Fear in their eyes, fear in their posture, fear that the power they once enjoyed was gone. I leaned back in the judge's chair. It felt natural. It felt right, like this seat had been waiting for me all along. The leather creaked under my weight. The gavel rested firmly in my hand, and I could feel the energy in the room bending toward me. The irony was almost painful to watch. They had dragged me here for refusing to repaint a door. A door, the color of my house, had become their weapon, their excuse to humiliate me. But now, sitting high above them, that same petty violation became my shield, my reason to expose them all. I cleared my throat. The sound cracked through the silence like thunder, and I began to speak. You accused me of breaking your rules, I said. You fined me, you threatened me. You even dared to strike me. And all because I chose a color. The crowd shifted, some whispered, others looked down, ashamed, because deep inside, they knew it was ridiculous. They knew it was petty, but they had played along. Because fear makes people follow even the stupidest of rules. The officer clenched his fists, but he didn't move. He knew better now. His power had slipped through his fingers, and I was not going to give it back. I turned my eyes to the HOA president, her lips pressed into a thin line, her face red with anger and embarrassment. You wanted control, I said. You thought this neighborhood belonged to you. You wrote rules not to protect the people but to control them. And you used these officers to enforce your pride. Her eyes narrowed. She wanted to speak, but I raised the gavel again, and the room hushed instantly. Because in that moment, they knew whose word truly mattered. I paused, letting the weight of silence stretch, letting them drown in the truth of their actions. And then I asked, what is worse, breaking a painted door rule or breaking the dignity of a person? The question cut through them like a blade. I could see it on their faces. Some looked guilty, some looked furious, but none could deny the truth. None could escape the shame. The judge who had stepped aside remained in the corner. His eyes never left me. He knew this wasn't just about me. It wasn't about a door. It wasn't even about the slap. It was about power. How fragile it was. How quickly it could change hands. I let the crowd sit in their silence, because silence has its own way of speaking. It tells you more than words ever could. And in that silence, I saw their fear, their confusion, their realization. Then, slowly, I leaned forward, my hands pressed firmly against the bench, my voice steady. You wanted me small, I said, but look at me now. You wanted me quiet, but my voice is louder than your rules. You wanted me gone, but I am here, and you cannot move me. Every word was heavy. Every word was final. The power in the room belonged to me, and they could feel it in their bones. The officer took a step back, the HOA president's smirk was gone, and the audience, once amused, now sat frozen, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to even look me in the eye. I raised the gavel once more. It struck like a heartbeat, and with every strike, the truth became clearer. They had tried to shame me, but instead they had crowned me. They had tried to bury me, but instead they had lifted me higher. And now they had to face what they had created, their own downfall, their own humiliation. Born from their arrogance, the room belonged to me. The silence belonged to me. The fear belonged to me, and I let it sink into them slowly. Because sometimes justice is not about punishment. Sometimes justice is about reflection, forcing them to see what they truly are. And as I looked down at the faces staring back at me, I couldn't help but wonder, if you were in that seat, with all eyes on you, with your enemies trembling below, would you show them mercy, or would you let them drown in the silence they created for you? The silence was heavy, but tension is never truly silent. It hums, it vibrates, it sits in the chest of everyone who feels it, and that courtroom was drowning in it. The officer's jaw clenched, his pride bruised, his hand twitched, like he wanted to strike again. But he didn't, because now every eye in the room was on me, and no one would protect him if he dared. The HOA president shifted in her chair. She tried to adjust her papers. She tried to look composed, but her hands shook. The very woman who had built her reputation on control, on intimidation, was now losing it all under my stare. I leaned forward from the judge's seat, the gavel resting like a weapon in my hand. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight. My voice carried more weight than their threats ever could. You wanted power, I said, and for a while you had it. But the truth is, you never controlled me. You only controlled the fear of those who followed you. Her lips trembled. She tried to speak, but the words never came, and in that hesitation, she admitted everything. Her silence was louder than any confession. The crowd fidgeted in their seats. They weren't sure if they were watching a trial or a reckoning. They weren't sure if they should cheer or stay quiet, because what they were witnessing was not in any handbook, not in any HOA rule. This was something far greater. The officer took another step back, but I did not let him escape my eyes. You, I said firmly. You thought respect came from your badge, from your hand, from the sound of a slap. But respect is not taken, it is earned. And today, you have lost it all. His face turned red. His lips curled like he wanted to spit an insult. But he stopped himself, because deep inside, he knew he had already lost, and nothing he said could fix it. The audience leaned closer. Some nodded. Slowly, others looked away, because they knew they had seen these games before. They had seen the petty fines, the threats, the intimidation. But this was the first time someone stood above it all, not as a victim, but as a judge. I let the silence breathe again, because silence is powerful. It makes people hear their own thoughts. It forces them to face the truth, and I wanted them to sit in it, to drown in it, because that was justice too. The HOA president finally found her voice. "This is illegal," she muttered, her words weak, her confidence cracked. "This is not your seat anymore." I leaned back slowly. A smile tugged at my lips. "Not my seat," I said softly. "Then why does it fit me so perfectly?" the audience gasped. Her face turned white, because she knew. She had lost the war of words before it even began. The judge in the corner remained silent. He didn't need to speak. His absence from the bench was enough. His retreat was proof that he knew my presence here was not a mistake, but a correction, and deep inside, I wondered, did the crowd understand? Did they see the irony? That the very people who wanted to strip me of dignity had given me the stage to reveal who I truly was. I tapped the gavel once more. The sound echoed through the wood, and I declared, "This is not about a door, or a color, or a rule. This is about power, and what happens when it is abused." The HOO president lowered her eyes. The officer swallowed hard, and the crowd sat in silence, because the truth was undeniable. The petty rules had been a mask, but now the mask had fallen. I let my eyes sweep across the room, from the president to the officers, from the audience to the shadows in the corner, and I asked, "How many of you followed these rules out of belief, and how many out of fear?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one dared to answer, but their silence was an answer in itself, and it told me everything I needed to know. The gavel rested again in my hand, and I realized something. Justice is not just about punishing the guilty. Sometimes it is about exposing the truth, stripping away the masks. and letting everyone see the rot beneath. I could feel the shift in the room. The power no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. But more importantly, it belonged to the truth. And as I looked down at them, I couldn't help but wonder, if you were in my place, would you crush them with punishment? Or would you let them suffer in the weight of their own shame, the weight of the room pressed down on every shoulder? The gavel still rested in my hand, and the silence clung to the walls like smoke that refused to leave. But silence never lasts forever. It cracks, it breaks, it demands to be filled. And this time it was broken by laughter, a sharp laugh, the kind that cuts through air and makes your skin crawl. It came from the HOA president, her lips curled, her eyes burning with pride that refused to die. "You think this changes anything," she hissed. "You think sitting in that chair makes you powerful." Her voice rose. "Look around you. This is still my neighborhood, my board, my rules." Her words carried arrogance, but her hands betrayed. They shook as she gripped the edge of the table, her body leaning forward, desperate to reclaim what she had lost. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply watched, because sometimes the most powerful response is stillness, letting them drown in the sound of their own desperation. The officer beside her stepped forward, his chest puffed out. He wanted to intimidate me again. He wanted to show the crowd that the slap had not broken me, because now he would. But when his eyes met mine, he hesitated, because something had shifted. He no longer looked down on me. He looked up, and that terrified him. "You don't belong here," the president spat again. "You are nothing without our approval." Her words trembled. She wanted them to sound like steel, but they came out like glass, fragile and ready to shatter. I leaned forward, my hands resting firmly on the bench, and my voice cut through her anger like a blade. "Then why are you the one shaking?" The crowd gasped. The president froze. Her lips parted, but no words came, because in that one question, her mask crumbled. I stood tall, the gavel heavy in my grip, and I let my words fall slow, each one heavier than the last. "You fine people for grass, but you cannot grow your own respect. You measure mailboxes, but you cannot measure your own dignity. You demand power, but you cannot even control your own fear." The audience murmured. Some nodded. Others looked down in shame. Because they had followed her, they had let her rule them with fear. And now they saw her weakness. The officer shifted again. He wanted to speak. He wanted to defend her. But his silence was louder than anything he could say, because silence is what fear sounds like when it has no escape. The judge, who had stepped aside, remained in the corner, his eyes fixed on me. He said nothing, but his stillness was approval, like he too understood that justice was unfolding in a way no book could teach. The HOA president tried to gather herself. She straightened her back. She forced her lips into a smile. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted left and right, searching for all eyes, but finding none. I let the silence grow again. I let her stew in it, and then I asked the question that had been hanging unspoken in the air. Who do you really serve? The people or your pride? The room shifted. The audience looked at each other, because they knew the answer. They had always known, but never dared to say it. Until now, when the truth was standing in front of them, her smile faltered. Her shoulders sank, and for the first time, she looked small, smaller than I had ever seen her. I could feel the energy in the room turning. The power had changed hands completely. It wasn't hers anymore. It wasn't the officers. It wasn't even the judges. It was mine. But power is not about holding it. It is about what you do with it. And in that moment, I realized this was bigger than me, bigger than a slap, bigger than a door. This was about a community that had been trapped in fear. And finally, they were watching fear lose. I raised the gavel again. The sound of wood striking wood echoed like thunder, and I declared, "This is no longer your courtroom. This is no longer your rule. This is justice, and justice does not bow to your pride. The president sank back into her chair, her eyes wet, her voice silent. The officer's shoulders dropped, his fists unclenched, because deep inside, he knew there was no fight left to win. The crowd erupted in whispers. Some leaned forward with wide eyes. Others sat back, stunned, and all of them knew one thing. The game had ended, the story had flipped, and nothing would ever be the same. I let the whispers grow. I let them feel the weight of what they had just witnessed. Because this wasn't just my victory. It was theirs too. Theirs to remember, theirs to carry, theirs to tell. And as I looked down from the bench, at the faces of those who had laughed, mocked, and judged me, I couldn't help but wonder, if you were sitting in that audience, would you have stood with them in silence? Or would you have found the courage to stand with me? The gavel had silenced the room, but silence never lasts. It only hides the storm waiting underneath, and the storm came back with fury. The HOA president slammed her hand against the table. Her chair screeched across the floor. Her voice rose, sharp and trembling. You think this is over? You think one speech makes you the hero. But power doesn't shift with words. It shifts with force. Her face was flushed red, her eyes wild, and for the first time I realized fear wasn't the only thing controlling her. It was desperation, the kind that makes people reckless. The officer beside her didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He tried to tower over me, his shadow stretching across the bench like a threat. But shadows don't scare me. Not anymore. He leaned close, his breath hot with anger. You've had your show. Now step down before this gets ugly. I met his eyes without blinking, and I spoke low, steady. Ugly already started when you raised your hand against me. The crowd gasped. The words hit harder than the slap ever had. Because truth has a way of cutting deeper than fists, the officer froze. His lips tightened, but his hands, they trembled. Not with strength, but with uncertainty. He wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Not as a man who abused power, but as a man stripped of it. The president pounded the table again, her voice breaking. This neighborhood is mine. This board is mine. This courtroom is mine. Every word cracked like glass shattering. Every word betrayed the weakness behind her rage. And then something unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a voice rose, soft but steady. No, it belongs to us. Every head turned. It was an elderly man. One I had seen before, but never heard speak. His hands were frail, his back bent with years, but his eyes were steady. As he stood, and his words carried the weight of truth. This place has been ruled by fear for too long. He said, we paid our dues, followed rules, and swallowed shame, all for peace we never received. He looked at me, then at her. But today, peace is no longer hers to give. The crowd stirred. More voices joined in. Whispers became words, words became shouts, and suddenly the president was no longer the leader. She was the outcast, drowning in the noise of rebellion. She screamed above them, you're fools, all of you. You think you're free, but without me, this neighborhood falls apart. But even as she spoke, her voice was lost in the wave of defiance, because once people taste freedom, they never swallow chains again. I raised the gavel. The sound of it striking wood once more cut through the chaos, and silence returned. But this time, it wasn't forced. It was chosen. They were waiting, not for her, but for me. I looked at the crowd, then at the trembling officer, then at the woman whose pride had built this fragile empire. And I spoke slow, clear. This is not your kingdom. This is not your throne. This is not your prison. This is a community, and today it takes back its voice. The president's lips quivered. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. Her words had run dry. Her power had run dry, and all that was left was the silence of her fall. The officer stepped back, his eyes lowered for the first time. He looked small too, not because I made him small, but because the people did. Their gaze stripped him of the authority he abused. I set the gavel down, slowly, firmly, and I leaned forward. The law is not a weapon. The law is not a toy. The law is not a mask to hide cruelty. The law is balance. The law is truth. The law is justice. The crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't wild. It wasn't chaotic. It was steady, like thunder rolling across a storm that had finally broken. And as I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw something I had not seen before. Hope. The president's shoulders collapsed. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "This isn't how it was supposed to end." I stared at her, and for a moment, I almost felt pity. But pity has no place when justice stands, because justice is not about what you expect. It is about what you deserve, and as the room held its breath, I couldn't help but wonder, if you were sitting on that bench instead of me, would you have had the strength to raise the gavel? Or would you have let fear win? The gavel was heavy in my hand, but the weight I felt was not wood. It was history. It was silence finally breaking. It was justice demanding to be heard. The president sat frozen, her eyes wide, her body stiff. Like a queen who just realized her crown was paper, the officer shifted behind her, his chest rising and falling. But even his uniform looked weaker now, like cloth without meaning. The crowd was still buzzing, whispers and breaths filling the room. But all of them waited for me. They were not looking at her anymore. They were not looking at him. They were looking at me. And for the first time, I understood what it truly meant to carry power. I rose from the chair, slowly, every step echoing across the floor. I walked down from the bench, closer to them, closer to the people who had once laughed, mocked, judged, and now sat in silence, waiting. I stopped in front of the president. Her lips trembled, her voice finally escaping in a broken whisper. "You can't erase me," she said it once, then again, as if repeating it might make it true. "You can't erase me." I looked at her, and I said softly, "No one had to erase you. You erased yourself." Her face twisted, her pride bleeding through every crack. But the room knew it, the people knew it, and she knew it too. The elderly man in the back stood again, his voice steady. "Enough." Just one word. But it was enough, because sometimes all it takes is a single voice to bury a throne. The crowd nodded, one by one, and soon their silence became her judgment. Not written on paper, not declared by law, but carved in shame. The officer lowered his gaze. He removed his hat and placed it against his chest. It was not respect. It was surrender. And the whole room saw it. I turned to the bench again, and I raised the gavel one last time. The sound struck through the air, sharp, final. It was not just the end of a trial. It was the end of an era. I spoke clear, strong. This court does not belong to tyranny. It does not belong to fear. It belongs to truth. The crowd erupted, but this time not in whispers, not in murmurs. It was cheers. It was claps. It was voices rising together, the sound of chains breaking, the sound of people remembering they were never powerless. The president shrank in her seat, her eyes glassy, her hands clenched, but no sound came. She had ruled for years, but tonight she was ruled by silence. The officer guided her toward the door, not as a protector, not as her shield, but as a man, carrying away what was broken. And when that door shut, the echo of it was louder than any gavel strike. I looked around, faces full of relief, faces full of wonder, faces full of something that had been missing for too long. Hope. I breathed deep, and for the first time in that room, I felt peace, not because the fight was over, but because the truth had finally been spoken. The elderly man stepped forward, his voice calm, his words simple. "We are free now." And in that moment, I realized this story was not about me. It was not about the slap. It was not about the bench. It was about them. The people who had lived under the shadow and finally stepped into the light. I placed the gavel down on the bench, not in anger, not in defiance, but in peace. Because justice is not about who holds the gavel. It is about who feels its echo. The crowd began to leave, some smiling, some in tears, but all lighter than they had entered. And as I stood alone in the empty courtroom, I asked myself one question. Would they remember this night as the fall of a tyrant, or the rise of their courage? And now I ask you, if you had been sitting there, watching power collapse and truth rise, would you have stood with silence? Or would you have stood with justice?